Good morning, courageous men and women and boys and girls. Man, I am having so much fun studying the courageous men and women of the Bible because as you study, we begin to learn more and more that these are regular, real people that God chose to use, and because of their faith in God and their obedience to God, God gave them strength to do amazing things. So we're going to pick up the story on David. And you think after he had just killed Goliath, that Saul is just going to be so excited to have David on his team. Let's see how Saul responds, shall we? 1 Samuel chapter 18. So after David had finished talking with Saul, he met Jonathan, the king's son, and there was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. Now, this is kind of interesting because, see, Jonathan, being the son of King Saul, he would normally be the next one in line to be the king. And Jonathan, I'm sure he knew that David had been anointed, or maybe he didn't know at this time, but he was not jealous of David. He loved him like a brother. And from that day on, Saul kept David with him and wouldn't let him return home. Because of his great warrior abilities, he wanted him close by. So in verse 5, whatever Saul asked David to do, David did it successfully. So Saul made him a commander over the men of war, an appointment that was welcomed by the people and Saul's officers alike. When the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistine, women from all of the towns of Israel came out to meet King Saul, and they sang and they danced for joy with tamarines and cymbals. This was their song. Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. Saul should have been really happy that David was in his army. But look at his reaction in verse 8. This made Saul very angry. What's this? They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands? Next, they'll be making them their king. So from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Now, Saul already knew that God had called someone else to be the king, but Saul was still not in alignment with what God wanted to do. And he was very jealous. So sometimes, even when you're doing the right thing, sometimes people may not like you because they're jealous of you. And so we need to just go ahead and be the person that we're called to be, regardless of how we're treated. So you're going to find out in verse 10, it gets even worse. The very next day, a tormenting spirit from God overwhelmed Saul, and he began to rave in his house like a madman. David was playing the harp as he did each day, but Saul had a spear in his hand, and he suddenly hurled it at David, intending to pin him to the wall. But David escaped him twice. So in the meantime, David is still playing the harp for King Saul because he's so tormented, because he is in such conflict between doing what is right and doing what is wrong, and just dealing with not being filled with the Spirit of God any longer, that he's tormented by the devil. And so the harp usually helps him to calm down and be at more peace. But he is so angry when he sees King David, he tries to kill him. So can you imagine the courage that it would take? And Saul was a warrior. I'm surprised he didn't strike him. So I have to believe that the Lord protected David, don't you? But, David had to be so courageous just to go every day and play the harp when Saul was so unpredictable. And so David was very courageous. And then notice in verse 12, who is not courageous? Who is the opposite of courage? He is full of fear. Saul was then afraid of David, for the Lord was with David and had turned away from Saul. So when he wasn't able to kill him with the spear, he became even more afraid of David because he realizes that God is with David and he is not with him. So finally Saul sent him away and appointed him commander over 1,000 men, and David faithfully led his troops into battle. David continued to succeed in everything he did, for the Lord was with him. When Saul recognized this, he became even more afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he was so successful at leading his troops into battle. So even when Saul sends David away, it still haunts him because David continues to be successful in everything that King Saul asks him to do. So David has to continually be courageous, knowing that Saul is jealous of him. And then one day Saul said to David, I'm ready to give you my older daughter, Merab, as your wife, but first you must prove yourself to be a real warrior by fighting the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, I'll send him out against the Philistines and let them kill him rather than doing it myself. But David explained, who am I and what is my family in Israel that I should be the king's son-in-law? My family is nothing. So David basically was saying, I'm not good enough for your daughter. I know you're wanting me to give her to me, but I just don't think I'm good enough for your daughter. So when the time came for Saul to give his daughter Merab in marriage to David, he gave her instead to Adriel, a man from Meholah. In the meantime, Saul's daughter Michal had fallen in love with David, and Saul was delighted when he heard about it. He said, hey, this is another chance to see him killed by the Philistines. But to David he said, today you have a second chance to become my son-in-law. Then Saul told his men to tell David, the king really likes you, and so do we. Why don't you accept the king's offer and become his son-in-law? When Saul's men said these things to David, he replied, how can a poor man from a humble family afford the bride price for the daughter of a king? When Saul's men reported this back to the king, he told them, tell David that all I want for the bride price is for him to kill 100 Philistines and bring him back proof from a very private part of their body. And you can look in verse 24. That was just to have proof that he had literally killed 100 Philistines. Vengeance on my enemies is all I really want. But really what Saul had in mind was that David would be killed in the fight. But David was not one to be afraid, was he? He always had courage, and he accepted the offer. So him and his men went out, and they killed 200 Philistines. Not just 100. He did 2 times as many as Saul expected. And he presented, he came back with the king and had proof that he had killed 200 Philistines. So Saul gave his daughter Michal to David to be his wife. And in verse 28, when Saul realized that the Lord was with David and how much his daughter Michal loved him, Saul became even more afraid of him, and he remained David's enemy for the rest of his life. Every time the commanders of the Philistines attacked, David was more successful against them than all the rest of Saul's officers. So David's name became very famous. So instead of Saul realizing that David was the Lord's anointed, he actually became more and more bitter about it and actually became an enemy of someone who was totally supportive of him. So Saul became more fearful, David became more courageous and successful. So we need to be sure that we don't become like Saul in any way and be bitter or jealous against people who God is using in a great way. Because God wants to use us all in a great way. He wanted to use Saul, didn't he? But Saul refused to do and to follow God's leading. And if we're like David and people are jealous of us, we need not to be disrespectful to them, but we need to continue being the person that God's called us to be. So I hope that you're courageous today, and I hope you have an amazing, peaceful, wonderful day with lots of joy and love and surprises. But if you have to be courageous today, I know that you can because God is with you. You can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. Have an awesome day. Bye for now.